Welcome to Thinking in Loops, using Loopy training to get precision, speed, and engagement without over-arousal. Hi, I'm Elaine Lawler, and I'm your instructor for this webinar masterclass. Why use Loopy training? That is what we're going to be talking about for the next hour together. Why we want to use it, why it's important, and how to put it into practice. If you're like me, and I suspect you might be, in that you love dog sports as much as I do, you also really love working with a dog who is engaged, focused, happy, confident, and who goes fast where I need them to go fast. The problem that many of us face doing dog sport training is that we tend to use a fair bit of arousal to get that speed, to get that engagement, to get that dog that looks really happy and up. And the problem with using arousal to get these results is that arousal can come with a lot of baggage. And maybe you found that out the hard way. Maybe that's why you're here. When we use arousal to get speed, and we tend to lose precision. We tend to lose predictability. And we can have a lot of fallout. We can have dogs that get too worked up and they start to bark and spin and go off course and develop behavior problems. Or we can get dogs that do the exact opposite and shut down and get slow and sticky. They may lose their love of the game. They may start to not want to train at all. Now, if any of these challenges are what you face, if that's why you're here, you're in the right place, because we're going to examine how to use Loopy training to get the results that you're seeking without over-arousal. Are you ready? Let's dive in. Which of the following do you struggle with? Precision, speed, too much or too little, engagement, or generally arousal problems across the board? Stress high or stress low behaviors. If you're watching this live, drop it in the chat. Which one of these, or if there's more than one, you can put down multiples. Which number applies to you? If you're listening to this on the replay, just make note of it. Just be aware. Where are you really struggling with your training right now? Or if you're not really struggling, where would you like to get better? This is what Loopy training is going to help you with. Very briefly, here's how we're going to proceed over the next hour together. First, we're going to talk about why it's important to train your brain and your eye to think and see in loops, and how to put this into practice. We're going to talk about what Loopy training actually is, and then how to apply it in real everyday life training. Okay, so why is Loopy training important? Very succinctly, it's important because training is communication. Let me just turn my camera on for a second, have a little chat about this. Okay, I'm not sure if you've ever thought about this question before, but it's one that I've pondered for a while now. What is training? What is it, this thing we call training that we do with our dogs? Well, I'm going to argue that training is building a communication system with our dogs. Now, hear me out. We might think about training as teaching our dogs to do various behaviors. Sit, stay down, herd sheep, weave through poles, go over obstacles, hit contacts, follow scents, and so on and so forth. But the reality is that our dogs actually know how to do these things. They come out of the box knowing how to do these things. They're born knowing how to sniff and run and sit and lie down and weave through things. And if they're, selected for herding instinct, how to herd sheep, and so on and so forth. We don't teach our dogs those behaviors. What we teach our dogs is when to do those behaviors. And that means what we're actually teaching our dogs is how to understand what we are asking of them. In other words, we are building a communication system with a dog. We need to be able to speak to our dogs, and we need to be able to understand what they're saying in return. Speak to our dogs in a way that they understand us, and then listen to them and understand what they are saying in response. And we speak to them in cues and reinforcement, and they speak to us in behavior in return. So it's this dance back and forth. We cue, they behave, we reinforce. right? Back and forth. And so what's really critical here is developing a communication system that is clear and that both parties can understand. And this is where Loopy training comes in. It's the core, it's an essential component for building that communication system. And when you master Loopy training, your ability to communicate with your dog is going to skyrocket. Okay, again, training is communication, and we humans speak in cues and reinforcement, and our dogs speak in behavior. So training is basically like this. We give a cue, please do X. Please sit, please lie down, please whatever we're asking our dog to do. Please do X. Our dog responds by doing a behavior. And if the behavior is X, we reply, yes, that's what I wanted. And we use reinforcement as a way of making it clear to our dog that they did what we wanted them to do. And as we develop our training skills with our dog, and our dog learns how to respond, we do this little dance back and forth. The reinforcement tells the dog that what they did was correct, and they can start to learn, okay, when I did X, I got a cookie. My human made this sound that I responded to, and then I got a cookie. Now, here's the challenge. Here's where things get tricky. What if your dog did more than one behavior between the time that you gave the cue and the time that you handed your dog the reinforcement? How is your dog supposed to know which behavior is correct? For instance, what if you asked your dog to sit and your dog looked up at your face, shuffled her feet, maybe dropped her head, shifted her weight around a little bit, and then leaned back and sat down. And then you said yes and gave a cookie. Now, which one of those behaviors was the one that got reinforced by the cookie? Well, if your dog isn't sure which one, the dog is going to chain those all together. And soon you're going to end up with a sit that contains all of those other behaviors. Sometimes we can end up with a dog who starts to get frustrated and they're not sure how to get the cookie. So perhaps you have this dog who, like I said, now has a whole bunch of behaviors that they associate with the word sit. Shuffling feet, looking up and down, shifting weight, and then sitting. And you don't want that. So you start to wait until you get a nicer sit. And then your dog starts to get frustrated. You might start getting some discouraged behavior. You might get some arousal behavior. And training starts to fall apart. Training starts to be frustrating at both ends of the leash. When the communication starts to be unclear like this, when we cue and our dogs do behaviors and we reinforce the behaviors, but what we are cueing and what we are reinforcing is not clear to the dog, and the behaviors that happen in between the cue and the reinforcement are not specifically precisely what we're looking for, we can end up with a lot of fallout. For instance, what we often see are dogs who become what I call hyper-operant. Maybe they start throwing all sorts of behaviors around. We might see dogs who start to stress high. They bark, they spin, they bite, they otherwise get really wound up. Sometimes they'll get clownish as well and get all silly. We might get dogs that start to stress low. They will get sniffy, they quit, they get slow, they start to look sad. We might get a dog who starts to lose interest in training. And the other thing that happens is if we start getting a lot of arousal built in, we will end up with making arousal part of our training picture. Let's take a look at what this looks like in practice. Here is me with my sweet little Kelpie, Holly, and this was from quite a few years ago now. Watch what happens when we don't have clarity in our communication system. So what I'm trying to do is get Holly to stand 2 front feet on this upside down, it's a frying pan actually, that I used as a pivot bowl. So I've just tossed a treat and watch Holly dance around like a monkey. So what is Holly? So I am trying to reinforce Holly with 2 feet on the pivot platform. And what is she doing? She is dancing like a monkey. She's shuffling all her paws around. She's moving all over the place. Now, why is she doing this? She's doing this. This is what I call hyper-operant behavior, in case you weren't familiar with the term. So she is not sure how to get reinforcement. So she's trying lots of things. The other thing, she's not clear what lets her know what is correct and what isn't correct. So right now, if you watch carefully, I'm using a clicker, but the clicker doesn't mean anything to her. What she's watching is my hand. So pay attention as she dances around, and then I move my hand to the bowl. When I move my hand to the bowl, that is her signal that she has done the right thing, that food is coming. And then she stops. Did you see that? I reached in, she stopped. We'll see it again. She's dancing, she's dancing, she's dancing. I click, she's still dancing. And then she stops. So as soon as I reach my hand for the bowl, then she stops. And notice how she's staring at my hand. So for her, my thinking is that the click is marking her, and that the bowl is the platform is cueing her. So the upside down platform is cueing her to stand on the platform, and so I expect her to go on the platform, and then I click to tell her yes, that she's done the right thing. However, that's not her experience at all. She's not sure how to get the cookie. She's dancing all over the place. I have reinforced all of that. So she thinks that the whole purpose here is to dance on the platform. And the click doesn't really mean anything to her. What tells her that food is coming is when I move my hand. Watch for one more second here. Okay, enough of watching poor Holly struggle to understand what I'm looking for her to do. When we have a clear communication system with our dog, we get something that looks quite different from the picture that you just saw. We end up with a dog who is confident, focused, calm, happy, fully engaged in the training, with high precision and low latency. And best of all, none of that dancing or junk behavior. Now let's take a look at what a simple clean loop looks like in practice. So this is an example of good, clear communication through Loopy training. What I've asked my dog to do here is simply to lie down and watch what she does. She lies down, and then she stands up, and then she lies down, and then she stands up, and then she lies down. So what we see here is a very simple, clean loop of standing and lying down and standing and lying down. And notice how Desiree's paws are not moving. She's not shifting. She's not looking around. The only extraneous behavior we have in this loop is a lot of tail wagging. And I'm okay with that. So this is a happy dog who knows how to earn her reinforcement. She's very clear on what's expected of her, and she knows how to execute it, and she's not throwing in all sorts of junk behaviors. She is doing exactly what she's asked to do, and she is earning her cookie. I am cueing her, she is performing the behavior, and then she is getting her reinforcement to let her know that she did exactly what I asked. So how do we get this very clean training, this very clear communication system? By using Loopy training. So what is Loopy training? Loopy training is a term coined by Alexandra Kurland, horse trainer, and inspired by her work with Dr. Jesus Rosales Ruiz. Very in a nutshell, Loopy training is simply good clicker training. Loops are everywhere in our training. As a clicker trainer, you're probably already using loops. And once you start to learn how to spot them, you will begin to see them everywhere. The goal of this webinar is to help you see and understand these loops so that you can use them intentionally to develop this clear communication system that I keep talking about, to improve your training mechanics, to solve problems, to build new behaviors. And most importantly, perhaps, is to make sure that your dog stays in an optimal state of arousal while training instead of going into over-arousal. As I said earlier, when we use arousal to get speed and engagement, we end up with a lot of fallout. You do not need arousal, over-arousal specifically, to get speed and to get engagement. What you need from your dog, what your dog needs from you, is clarity. Speed comes from confidence. Confidence comes from clarity. And clarity comes from Loopy training. So again, what is Loopy training? Now let's revisit the ABCs of behavior, of learning theory. Briefly, we have A, the antecedent, which stimulates the behavior, B, and that leads to a consequence, C. In other words, we have our cue, the dog does a behavior, and then there is reinforcement. Now, the way this is typically taught is exactly the way I have presented it here on the screen, in a linear fashion. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. It goes from left to right. However, this is not actually how training happens. Training actually happens like this. We have an antecedent, the dog does a behavior, then there's a consequence. And more precisely, when we're working with our dogs, we have a cue that leads to a behavior. We have a click. Now, if you use a marker word instead of a click, it's the same thing. I'm going to use a click to mean, a marker word or any signal that you give your dog to let them know that reinforcement is coming. And then you give them the reinforcement. And then there's another cue. And behavior, click, reinforce, cue. So it's actually a circular experience. It's not a linear experience, because the thing is training doesn't just end, right? I mean, it ends, but we keep behaving. We keep being cued to behave. We keep being reinforced for our behavior. This is happening ongoing constantly. When we are training, we are setting that up intentionally, but it doesn't stop the moment we stop training. So we need to start thinking in loops around how this works. Let me give you a little visual here. So think about sitting in a chair. When you go to sit in a chair, you start standing up. You don't start sitting in the chair. The behavior of sitting in the chair starts with you standing, and then you sit. Now, the behavior doesn't end with you sitting, because you can't sit if you're sitting. You can only sit if you're standing. So the behavior ends when you stand back up again. So the entire loop goes, you stand, you sit, and then you stand back up again. That is a complete loop. That's actually called a movement cycle. I don't want to get too far off down that rabbit hole, but if we think about movements as happening in a cycle, it is this loop that we're talking about here. Now, the difference between a movement cycle and Loopy training is that we add in reinforcement and markers. So we are constantly moving in movement cycles. When we make our movement intentional with training, or our dog's movement coupled with the cue and the reinforcer, then we end up with Loopy training. So a clean loop is one where we have no unwanted or junk behaviors. So again, think about the two videos I showed you. The first one with Holly dancing around on the pivot stand with all sorts of extraneous behaviors I did not want and didn't know how to get rid of, versus the very, very clean and simple behavior that Desiree was offering with her stand to down to stand to down. Now, again, the stand to down back to a stand is a movement cycle, similar to what I just described about standing and sitting in a chair. In that case, we have the desired behavior being performed correctly with Desiree. It's very fluent, there's no hesitation, it's very precise, there's low latency and high fluency. So she does it accurately and quickly. And the other thing that's really important is that we end the loop with the learner set up to perform the next behavior and start the next loop all over again. Now, here is where we need to get very clever with our training. As I said, behavior doesn't end just because we've clicked and fed. The dog is then going to be cued to do something else. Our job is to either have that planned out, or it will just happen spontaneously. So when we get very clear and effective with our Loopy training, we will have a plan for what we're going to do next when the dog has finished eating their treat. Again, with Desiree going up and down on the mat, I just kept repeating it 2 or 3 times in a row, and then when I was done, I tossed a search cookie for her to go off and chase to end that cycle, and then we moved on to the next thing. Now, Loopy training has a few simple rules. The first rule is that this loop that we're creating must be clean. By that I mean having no extra behaviors that we don't want on both sides of the click. So that means that the dog does a clean behavior, we click, and then we feed the dog or give them their toy. And we want that to be a clean behavior as well. So what we don't want, for instance, is for our dog to do the behavior and then we click and then they do something else before we feed them. Here's an example of having extraneous behavior between the click and the delivery of the reinforcement. So specifically, I'm not actually using a click here. I'm using the word yep, which is a marker word, serves the same function. I've asked Desiree to give me a chin rest. She's sitting here beautifully, giving me a perfect, beautiful chin rest. I say yep, and then I hold the cookie up to feed her. And what happens? She goes up, lifts her front feet off the ground to take the cookie. So you can see all that movement with her front feet. That is extraneous behavior that we don't want in the loop. That means that the loop is no longer clean. Watch that again. Yeah, see how she jumps up like that? That is what we're trying to avoid. All I want her to do is put her chin in my hand and then lift her nose up enough to be able to eat the cookie and then put her chin back down in my hand. And that would be a perfect clean loop. So how do I get this lovely clean loop on the other side of the click? With how I deliver my reinforcement. So I need to change how I'm delivering the reinforcement to keep the behavior clean. All I need to do in this case is not hold my hand up so high so that she doesn't have to jump up to get the food. And then we end up with a beautiful clean loop. Take a look. So all I needed to do there was just tweak my reinforcement placement, and I had a clean loop on both sides of the click. The next rule of Loopy training is that once you have achieved your clean loop, you can move on, you can change criteria, you can grow the behavior to the next step. And the third rule of Loopy training is, once you have achieved your clean loop, not only can you move on, but you should move on. Let me just hop on with my camera again for a second. This is a really important concept to understand. Whether or not you adopt Loopy training as your approach to training, not repeating behaviors over and over again is going to be really important for helping your communication system with your dog. What ends up happening when we keep doing the same behavior over and over again is that the dog starts to question whether they've maybe done something wrong. I learned this by actually playing clicker games with a partner where I was the dog and I had somebody clicker training me. She asked me to do something very simple. When we weren't allowed to speak, this was at a training seminar, we weren't allowed to speak to each other. The only communication we had was a clicker and some M&Ms. And so I did the behavior and then she would click and give me an M&M. And then I would do the behavior and she would click and do the M&M. The behavior was very simple. It was just me picking up, I think I just had to pick up a glass and put it back down again. And I got it, I think, on the first or second repetition. And then she kept clicking. And so I pick up the glass and put it down and she would click. And then I'd pick up the glass and put it down and she would click. And after 3 or 4 or 5 times of doing this, I started to think, hey, there must be something more to this. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. I mean, it can't be this easy. So she keeps asking me to do it. There must be something else. And so I started to improvise. So I started to pick up the glass and make it do a little jig. And then I'd put it down and then she would click. And I started to add in more and more behaviors. So it started looking like Holly dancing on the pivot platform with me with my glass. And the reason I was doing this was because I didn't know why she kept asking me over and over again to keep doing the behavior. And the reason she kept asking me over and over again to do the behavior was because we had a timer for 3 minutes. And I got the behavior in the first 3 seconds of the exercise, and she kept going and going and going. And by the end of the 3 minutes, we were both so frustrated and I was so confused and she was very confused. And I had this elaborate routine that I had come up with the glass. And she had no idea how to get rid of all of that extra behavior. So that taught me very clearly the importance of this rule of loopy training. When you get your clean loop, you can move on to the next level of criteria. And not only can you move on, you should move on. An added bonus to this approach to training is that you can toss the 80-20 rule out the window. I don't know if you're familiar with this rule or if this is something that's still in common practice. It's not something that I've used for quite a while now, but I've been using loopy training. Once upon a time, I was told to keep working on a behavior until the dog could perform it 80% of the time. So that meant if I did 5 repetitions, the dog needed to be perfect 4 times. If I did 10 repetitions, the dog needed to be perfect 8 times. Now, as I just described, what ends up happening often, and you may have experienced this, is your dog gets something right 2 or 3 times in a row. They're enthusiastic, they're happy, they're having a good time, and then you keep going. And then the behavior starts to fall apart. So if you're trying to get 80% of the time right, and let's say your dog gets it right the first 3 times, and then they start to think, hey, what's wrong? Maybe I need to do something different because she keeps asking me to do this again, and they do something wrong on the 4th time, then you've lost then you have to go, now you need to go keep going to do it 10 times and get 8 of them right. And the more you do it, the more the behavior falls apart, and it gets harder and harder and harder to get that 80%. But when you use the loopy training rule, you can move on, and not only can you move on, you should move on as soon as you get that clean loop. And if it takes 1 repetition, then you move on after that 1 repetition. If it takes 2 or 3, then you move on after 2 or 3. Now, importantly, this means that you need to know what your next criteria step is going to be. And often when we go into training, we don't really think that far ahead. So it's really critical when you want to be a good, clear, clean, loopy training clicker trainer, is you want to think about the steps that you want to walk your dog through. So when you go to train, you have your criteria planned out ahead of time. Now, of course, you can't always be perfect. You often need to improvise, but having some familiarity of where you're going and what your next steps are is important as you go into the exercise, because you don't know how quickly your dog is going to get that clean loop, and it may happen very quickly, and you need to know what to do next. Now, if you don't know what your next step of the criteria is because you achieved what you set out to do and you don't know you hadn't really thought about the next step, then end the training. It's very simple. I always like to just throw a scatter on the ground. That's my end of training routine that I do for everything. My dogs know they've done a good job, and we're going to take a little break. And then you can think about it and decide what your next step is. Don't just improvise on the fly if you don't know what you're doing. You can just stop, think about it, and then come back. Now let's take a look at how to put loopy training into practice in a really practical sense that you can apply immediately today. So again, we have our little loop here where we have our cue, behavior, click, reinforce, cue, behavior, click, reinforce, that we go round and round. This is how I want you to start thinking about your training as you plan it and execute it. Now, this is how we start to build loopy training into our practice. And actually, let me just turn my camera on again for a second. Have another little chat here. Here's something that's really important to remember. There is a lot that I am sharing here that takes a lot of training and practice and trial and error and experimenting to really figure this out. I don't have it 100%, and I've been doing this for several years now. So what I would like you to do simply is to do some of these small exercises that I'm going to be sharing with you next, and get the idea of loopy training. Start to practice it. Don't try to put it in across the board in all your training right off the bat. That's going to lead to frustration. You're going to be lumping yourself. And until you really get the mechanics down, until you get some practice, until you really get a sense of how this works, where it works, and how to apply it, you don't want to be trying to make everything about loops in your training if that's not where you're already at. All you need to do is do these little exercises, play around with them, and start to train your brain. And what you'll find is that will start to have a ripple effect across your training. So for now, again, just do these. If you did 2 minutes a day of your training, or 2 minutes even once a week, and just thought about Loopy training, it will have a ripple effect across all of your training, and then you can grow it from there. Okay, so putting Loopy training into practice. The very first thing we need to do is we need to get what I call an anchor loop. So we start with a little tiny loop, and then we start to expand the loop. Or you could start putting loops together and making a chain. So I want you to think in terms of little tiny loops to start. And the first anchor loop that I teach is the feeding loop. So basically, can you take a cookie cleanly? Now remember how I was feeding Desiree with her chin rest, and she was jumping up and her feet were flapping around in the air? That's not clean eating. So we need to get that piece in place first. And then from there, we can start to expand and grow our loops. So again, we want clean food delivery as our smallest anchor loop. If we don't have that, everything else breaks down. I've already shown you examples of that, with Holly dancing around, with Desiree pulling her feet off the ground. And those are just a couple of very simple examples, and we can have a lot more fallout that happens when we don't get our food delivery clean and clear to our dog. Because remember how our communication system is being built around us giving a cue and then delivering reinforcement to let the dog know when they have been correct. And so we need to be able to get that reinforcement to them in a way that is very, very clear, that gives the most clear information. It's not just about giving them a cookie to make them happy. Of course, we want that, but it's the delivery is also information. Okay, so we want to work on that, and we wanted to make sure that we're very clear in advance. So you also want to practice this without your dog. Your very first small loop should very simply look like this. Click, or your marker word, yep or yes or whatever, and feed. And the dog eats, and then you click and feed and click and feed. So your small little anchor loop looks like this. Click, eat, click. We think about the loop, and then you have the little nodule here is our click. What I'm going to suggest that you do in practice, and I'm going to show you a video in a sec to demonstrate this, but you start with click, where your dog comes to your hand for food and you feed. And then you can switch to just using a verbal marker if you prefer, yep. And you say yep, and you hand your dog a treat. Yep, and you hand a dog your treat. And then you can also, I like to have a couple of other feeding loops that are very well practiced. I like a search. So you toss a treat, the dog gets the treat and comes back. It's really important to toss one single treat, and what we really want to build that behavior of the dog gets the treat, comes right back, gets a treat, comes right back. That's really important for future training practice, because it gives you very precise, low latency behavior if you want to get a lot of repetitions of your training in, and you want to toss a search to reset your dog or change their position and so on. You don't want the dog going off and running around all over the place. So if they're very well practiced at, when you say search, there is one cookie, and they go out, they get the cookie, they come right back. We build that muscle memory. Then we have another really lovely little clean loop. And then I always end my training with a scatter, which is a way of telling my dog that the exercise is done. So I'm going to just show you this in practice with Desiree again. So watch here as I develop this clean loop behavior with Desiree. So I click, and I feed, and I click, and I feed. Now notice here, there's actually a lot of junk behavior going on. She's looking around, she's she's a little distracted. There's Griffey, he's walking by. She's not 100% fully engaged. You can see her brain is not 100% in the game here. We can see that there's a lip lick. And the reason for this is she's not 100% clear on what's going on. She's like, I'm sitting here, you're clicking and feeding. Am I supposed to do something? This is new for her. And some dogs, especially if you have training history, or if they don't have any training history, they're a little confused about what's going on. So they might not understand the click, or in this case, Desi does understand the click. She's not sure why she's not being asked to do anything, and I'm just clicking and feeding. However, what we see is, now, I don't know if you noticed that she took a little step with her paw. That was also junk behavior. So now I'm switching to the yep. And what I'm seeing here is a dog who is becoming more and more engaged. So remember what I talked about, how Loopy training gives engagement. We had a dog who was distracted, looking around, paying attention to lots of things, shuffling her feet, who is now starting to get the game. Oh, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. Now I am repeating this a few times. It's new, but I didn't have a clean loop. Then I got a clean loop, and then I switched to using a marker word. And now I've got a dog who's much more engaged now. And notice how the junk behavior disappears. I'm also using as clean mechanics as I possibly can. So my hands aren't flapping around. I'm not moving around. There's not a lot of extraneous stuff happening at my end either. I keep my hands still. I say yep. And then I feed. And notice how still we both are. And she's a little distracted by the other dog walking by. Search. Now I do search. I toss one cookie. She comes right back and sits. So that's also very nice clean loop. Okay, so you hopefully get the idea of how to create what we're looking for in terms of having the behavior be as clean as possible, and just repeat 2 or 3 times until you've got that. When you're first teaching them, you may need to practice it a few more times, and then you can start putting this little series of anchor loops into practice as you grow your training and use larger loops. We're going to get to that next. So now that we have our little clean anchor loops, the feeding loop, the search loop, we can start to add in a behavior. This is how we grow our loop. So we start with the anchor loop, the little hand or hand to the cookie to the dog and click. And now we can ask for something. Now that we have that loop all nice and clean, we can expand it and we ask for a behavior. So we can cue our dog, ask for the behavior, and then we mark, and then we feed and repeat. And so we now have a slightly bigger, larger loop happening. But we still need to keep all of the rules of Loopy training in play and keep everything as clean as possible. I'm going to flip my camera back on for a second. This is also really important to understand. When we create a loop, as much as we want it to be clean, very often it is not clean. So recall what I just showed you in the video a second ago with Desiree. The loop, she was initially sort of looking around, shuffling her feet, being a little distracted, and then I tightened up the loop, and then she became more focused. So typically you're going to start with a loop that's messy, and that's okay. We don't mind it being messy. The mess gives us information about how to clean it up. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then we prune out the parts that are messy until we get it clean. And then once we get it clean, then we move to the next step. So you don't typically start with a clean loop, you work towards and end with a clean loop.